Hey YouTube, how's it going? I am back with another video. Today's build is going to be with a Thrive 20-gallon hex terrarium, which I got from my nephew for free. Well, I probably wouldn't have bought something like this myself just because of the shape of it. I think it turned out really well in the end. The first step in this build is attaching the cork bark to the glass using hot glue, and then later on I'll go back over it with silicone for a permanent bond. For this build, I'll also be using a new silicone I just discovered online from Kraken Bond. Now, I've been using it on another project I'm working on, and so far I really like it. It's got great adhesion, it dries fairly quickly, and it has very low odor. Now, what I like most about it though is that you can buy a case online from the company of 12 tubes for 84 bucks, and with tax it works out to be just over $7 a tube. Now, this next cork bark tube I am going to use as a planter on the top half, and since I'm using it as a planter, I want good drainage, but I also don't want animals to go inside. So I'll close up both ends with some sponge filter pads. So just like before, once the glue dries, I will go behind it with some silicone just to hold it in place permanently. Now, because of the shape of this hex terrarium, I really don't have a lot of room to put too much cork bark tube. So I'll be using some Malaysian driftwood for some nice climbing and planting areas. Now, to fill in this gap that I thought an animal might get stuck behind, I'm just using a strip of sponge filter pad, which works really well for these areas. And now I'm going to start putting some cork bark pieces up on the glass just to fill in the gap here. I plan on putting another piece of driftwood above this. And it's a little too hard to do that once the wood's already in place. Now, if you do use this hot glue and silicone method, there is one thing you should not do, and that is to go too light on the silicone. You want a good bond between the glass and the wood, and not just trying to cover up the glue. So once you've got all your big hardscape pieces in place, what I like to do after I've covered up the glue is just to go around any transition areas between the cork tubes, wood, glass, anything like that, and just fill in the gaps with the silicone and then use the cocoa core to make a nice transition. If you use a lot of cork bark panel like I do, you're probably going to end up with a ton of small pieces, and this is probably the best way I found to get rid of them. Just lay down a nice thick layer of silicone. Start with your big pieces, lay those into the silicone, and then once you've got those down, you just go over it with a nice layer of cocoa core and just press everything in really nice and tight. Now, this is probably a great example of the adhesion properties of the silicone. Most other brands I use, when I put pieces on like this, they tend to just start to slide off immediately. Once I was done covering up the last of the background, I let the terrarium sit out overnight to finish curing the silicone. And then the next afternoon, I gave the terrarium a few good taps and went around with the brush and just knocked off any loose bits, and then I could go and do some touch-ups. And once those touch-ups cured overnight, I hit it with the hose a few times and let the tank sit out for a week. Now we start the fun part. Getting the drainage layer down, the drainage barrier, getting the substrate in, and getting some planting done. Now I know a lot of people like to use screen for their drainage barrier, but I much prefer using this fabric. If you've ever tried to pull a plant out of your terrarium that has its roots buried in the screen, you'll understand why this is a much better option. And to top everything off, just your standard ABG mix of sand, cocoa coir, sphagnum moss, pine bark, and charcoal. Once the substrate's all in, I like to give it a good pat down just to get rid of any voids that might be in there and make sure it's sloped, thicker in the back and thinner up front. Now just fill in my little cork bark tube and then go around with some sphagnum and fill some gaps here and there. It's great for planting moss, keeps the humidity up inside. It's also a good place for epiphytes to root. And now the fun part, the plants. Here I'm just going to add some random bromeliads, just because a terrarium would not be a terrarium without bromeliads. Luckily I had some nice bromeliad pups that had some really thin, long stolons, so getting the drill out, drilling out some appropriate sized holes, and done. Now, there really is no wrong or right way to mount bromeliads. The only suggestion I would have is to stagger them like you see me doing here for a nice natural look, and try to avoid mounting them either vertically or horizontally in line with each other. Now the next plant here in the substrate is this Peperomia trinervula, I think is how you pronounce it. I've never used this plant before, so it'll be interesting to see what it looks like. The Ficus pumila, you either love it or you absolutely hate it. My favorite, Selaginella cruciana brownii. Some Pilea hitchcockii dark mystery. Begonia fibrous hybrid torch, which unfortunately did not last, it melted away. And some Margravia melon, and a clipping I took off one of my wife's plants, a Philodendron Brazil. Now, probably one of the most important organisms in any terrarium is your springtails. And along with those, some dwarf white isopods, all of which are really great food for small critters in your terrariums. The next thing I like to do is give everything a nice good soaking before I put the leaf litter down, especially your substrate for the plants. Once everything is soaked really well, you can add your leaf litter. These are probably the most preferred leaf litter by anyone building a terrarium. It's live oak. They're really thick leaves. They last a long time compared to a lot of northern species of tree, which are really thin and decompose really quickly. Now I'm adding some magnolia leaves just to give a little different texture and look, followed by a few botanicals. The springtails really love to climb up on here, and then give everything a nice good soak again. Now, once you're all done, it's a good idea to let your terrarium sit for at least a month, a couple weeks at minimum, just to let the plants settle in and let your microfauna establish themselves. And for once, I'm going to complete a build and have the animals introduced all in the same video. Lesson number 1 for introducing animals to your terrarium, especially small ones like these. Open the container in the terrarium, not outside. Lucky for me, he jumped into the terrarium and not out of the terrarium, or I never would have found him. And now that that lesson's out of the way, these are my new Ranitomeya amazonica arena blancas. These are still juveniles. It's more of a yellowish orange head, but they will start to turn bright red, and they're really beautiful frogs, and I can't wait for them to get older and start calling. And that's a wrap on this video, and I think I'll just let it finish out with the ambient music and watching the frogs settle into their new homes. And until next time, see ya.